Good morning. Welcome to another Wake Up with Ashland. It's great to be back with you all. It's been a little while. Hope everyone had a good holiday season and has had a great start to 2022. We're glad to be back with you. We're restarting our series. Hopefully, as we move forward, we'll be able to do these a little more frequently and cover some more interesting topics. Today, we're going to talk about swords. And the reason for that is that I have two swords that have recently come into the collection that are pretty neat. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do two, I might as well do them all. We don't have that many. But I thought it would be interesting to look at the swords in our collection and talk about some of the stories associated with them and a little bit about sword technology, etc. So I've gotten our swords out and we'll look at a variety of examples across the 19th century. So we're going to start with this one right here. This one is one of the most important swords in the collection because it is associated with a very, very important historic event, and it's one of the few in the collection that we reasonably believe to be Henry Clay's. So this is a good place to start. It's also very new to the collection, not new to Ashland. We've had it on exhibit many times, but we recently acquired it. So this sword is what is called a short sword, or a small sword, because, well, it is small. You can see that. That's sort of a triangular blade, a little bit concave on one side. If you got close to it, it's hard to see. There's maybe a little etching on the blade, some etch work up here. I think there's a mark here somewhere that's marked IHB, which may be the maker. You'll notice it's got a metal hilt handle. This is called a quillion, this little thing. Quillions were part of a sword that were used to parry a blade. So if you had a full set, and I'll show you a bigger one later, you could use it to parry an opponent's blade. This is called a knuckle bow or a knuckle guard. It goes over the hand. The pommel is the piece at the end, which typically screws on and holds all of this together. So this is all metal on this. You can see that it's got kind of a pebble, which is designed to give it a grip so that you don't lose it when you're using it. Now, this sword actually is not meant to be used. It's not a sword that was built for the purposes of combat. The small sword is an evolution that resulted from the rapier. So rapier was a very long, straight, narrow sword, very sharp. Rapiers were used predominantly for dueling or personal combat between two people. And over time, the dueling rapier shrank and became this, which was meant to be symbolic. It was meant to represent prowess, power, honor, etc. And so they would be worn by people wishing to project those qualities. This one, we believe, was worn by Henry Clay when he negotiated the Treaty of Ghent as one of the 5 Americans sent to do that. Why or how do we know that? Well, we have several pieces of evidence for that. We know that in the 1930s, we have a newspaper article that shows his great-granddaughter had this sword in her home hanging beneath a picture of Henry Clay, so she believed it was Clay's. We know that her sister, another granddaughter by the name of Henrietta Clay, who lived here in Lexington, eventually donated this sword along with the second sword I'm going to show you to what was then called the Kentucky Life Museum. Now, many years ago, Waveland was not a historic site as it is today. It wasn't a state park. It was owned by the University of Kentucky. In fact, the back half of what is now Waveland is still the UK Agricultural Experiment Station, the part between Waveland and Man of War. But it was owned by UK, and they built a museum much like the Kentucky Historical Society that had all sorts of interesting artifacts relating to Kentucky history. Well, over the years, it's become a historic house museum dedicated to the Bryan family that built it. So this no longer had relevance at Waveland. We know it was donated there in the early 60s by Henrietta, and they decided to transfer it to us because we're the museum that deals with Henry Clay. So we know that it was there. We know that the family believed it to be Henry Clay's. We also have this picture, which you've seen before. This is a picture of Henry Clay in his diplomatic jacket and diplomatic attire at Ghent. And you can see here, the sword is present. So this indicates it was part of that attire. Now, the man that painted it is a man named William Welsh, local painter, interesting individual. Wrote a sort of autobiography of himself. We have a copy of it. One of the things we know about William Welsh is that he was, for a long time, engaged to Henry Clay's great-granddaughter Henrietta. Now, for reasons I am not entirely clear on, they never married. But by virtue of his engagement, he would have had access to the information that this was believed to be the sword carried by Henry Clay of Ghent. And that's the sort of place a gentleman would wear a sword like this. I mean, Ghent is a place, when he's negotiating a treaty with a foreign power, he wants to have tangible representation of his honor, his authority, the force with which he is negotiating, etc. So he's wearing a small sword. Another thing about this sword, the blade has been broken. You'll notice that it's sort of rounded off. There was probably, that much more blade, something like that. It snapped off, so somebody sort of rounded it and adjusted the length of the leather scabbard so they could continue to be worn, I suppose, or used, or in some fashion was rendered continuing to be usable instead of being tossed. So fortunately they saved it. Interesting thing about the small sword, you'll notice the shape of the blade. If I still had an epee, a fencing epee, you would be able to see readily that this blade is almost exactly the same shape as a fencing epee. So modern fencing weapons come from swords like this, at least the epee does. And those, of course, are used in sport. This is Henry Clay's Ghent sword. We display this in December when we put out the Ghent jacket. This is another sword that came to us from Waveland. It was thought for a long time to have been Henry Clay's. It is also a small sword. You see this one has a leather scabbard and it has its full length. Now the scabbard is missing a fitting. There should be a third brass fitting at the end to cover the point of the sword, and that simply has disappeared. It's not uncommon to find things like that. Just over time it probably got loose and eventually fell off, and somebody probably put it in a drawer intending to deal with it and never got around to it, and it just disappeared. But those things happen. Now, this one has a very, very attractive blade. This is called bluing. It is a treatment of the steel both for aesthetic and preservation reasons, or aesthetic and maintenance reasons. You can see here that it's got designs that are inlaid and coated with a brass wash or something similar. If you look at the hilt end of the sword, here we have a pommel, quillion again, that comes around into a knuckle bow. This is mother of pearl, so this is very fancy. You can see the American eagle here, some anthemions, and then this is an important feature. You see, this is the pommel, and it is in the shape of a woman wearing a feather headdress. This is often referred to, this type of blade, this particular sword is often referred to as an Indian maiden sword because of the pommel. This sword is about a circa 1830 U.S. infantry staff officer's sword, and this would have been worn for dress occasions to represent the rank and authority of that officer. This would not have been a sword, generally speaking, carried into battle. It's not a weapon. It's a ceremonial blade. Given the fact that it is a military blade, that would seem to indicate that this was not Henry Clay's. Henry Clay was never in the military, would have had no reason to have a military blade, certainly not in 1830. So whose is it? Well, there are several possibilities. Henry Clay Jr. graduated from West Point in 1831 and would have been commissioned an officer. And in fact, as far as I know, would have been an infantry officer. So he might have had a sword like this. Now, the question is, the two great-granddaughters that had these swords are a descendant of Henry Clay's son, Thomas. So why would Henry Jr.'s brother, Thomas, have ended up with his sword? Maybe he just wanted a reminder of his brother. The other possibility is that Thomas also went to West Point. Now, Thomas didn't graduate. He was only there a very short time, principally because he could not pass the math class. So didn't work out for him. But maybe he bought a sword or had a sword thinking that he would eventually go on. I don't know. So there is some mystery as to exactly whose sword this was. I don't have a lot of doubt that it was a family member. I mean, the family is usually pretty good about recalling those things. I just don't think this was Henry Clay's. This next sword is a very different kind of sword. This sword is a saber, and this type of sword was used in combat. It's a heavier sword with a full-size blade. The saber originates in Central Asia. primarily with Turkic peoples. Those people swept across Central Asia into Western Asia, conquering much of what we think of as the modern Middle East. Some of those peoples entered Europe. The Magyars, for example, settle in Hungary, and they bring these swords with them. And so by the 17th century in Europe, these are known and are being adapted for use by cavalrymen. So that's where this type of blade comes from. Now, whose sword was this? Well, that's an interesting question. We think we know, but we aren't exactly sure, nor are we sure exactly how or why it was created. So first of all, you can see it's got a beautiful brass scabbard. You can see that the handle is very ornate. It's sort of wrapped material, making the knuckle bow and the quillion. This symbol has sort of military designs, stars and stripes. You notice the eagle, that's a military motif. This is either ivory or bone, so again, another relatively rare material, not the most common material for this type of handle. So this is, again, it's very ornate. We draw the blade. You can see it's a lovely blade in very, very fine condition. There is some design work on it, if you look carefully as it reflects. It's pretty ornate, really. This is just a beautiful piece of work. Now, on the scabbard, it is engraved Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clay, Buena Vista, February 23rd, 1847. Henry Clay, here it's Henry Clay Jr., son of Henry Clay. He was a graduate of West Point, and in the Mexican War was commissioned Lieutenant Colonel of the 2nd Kentucky Volunteer Infantry. So he goes off to Mexico, and he is killed at Buena Vista. So this is a reference to the day he died and the battle where he was killed. Now, it seems pretty clear that this relates to Henry Jr. It may well have belonged to Henry Jr. We don't have exact details on that. We have several accounts that may account for it, but we don't have a hard document that places that. When Henry Jr. died, he was buried initially on the battlefield at Buena Vista, but not long after was exhumed and came back to the United States via the port of New Orleans and eventually to Lexington, to Frankfort. He's buried in the Frankfort Cemetery at the War Memorial. When he came back, most all of his stuff was sent back as well. So we have letters where Henry Clay is receiving his pistols, locks of hair, all sorts of things that come back from the battlefield. Nowhere in any of those is a sword mentioned. Doesn't mean it didn't come back, just means we don't have a letter or somebody saying, oh, by the way, I brought you Henry's sword. So we aren't sure. Now, interestingly, in an obituary of Henry's brother John, it talks about John's brothers. John was the youngest child of Henry Clay, the last of his sons to die. I guess probably the last of all of his children to die. He died in 1887, so they're recounting stuff about the other sons, and they talk about Henry Jr. And for some reason, they mention this sword. And what they say is that Henry Clay's valet, Charles, would show it off and tell the story of Henry Jr. using it at the Battle of Buena Vista and using the scabbard as a parrying device. In other words, to block his opponent's sword, and that it had a crease created from that use. So first of all, the account describes Charles as an old man. Well, we don't know whether Charles actually lived to be an old man. The last we know of Charles, he was about 40 and living in Washington, D.C. So that's not old by our standards anyway. I don't know whether they would have considered it old. I wonder if the person who's really doing this is Charles's father, Aaron, who was an old man, lived to a very old age, and died at John's house in 1866, probably by that time almost or about 80. So maybe that's who's telling the story rather than Charles. Regardless, is the story true? Well, let's look at the weapon, and we may be able to glean some information about it. So first of all, if you look at the scabbard, there is in fact a crease right there on the body of the scabbard. It's diagonal, and it certainly looks like the sort of crease you would expect to get from a blade. It's kind of long and thin, like he brought it up and blocked the sword coming down, and it created this dent in the scabbard. So that seems to fit. Now, if you look at the blade, however, Now, Henry Jr. is wielding this in a battle where he and his men are vastly outnumbered, and he asks them to abandon him on the field to get to safety. So he would have been fighting one against many. So he would have been striking spears and swords and perhaps gun butts and who knows what else with this blade. It doesn't show the kind of wear one would expect from that sort of use. You would expect nicks and dings and scratches and whatnot. This blade is almost immaculate. I mean, it's in beautiful condition. It's very shiny. It just doesn't seem to fit. So I don't know. It may or may not have been used on the field. Something else that we know about the men who served in Mexico is that some of them were given ceremonial sabers by the state government for their service. The man that commanded Henry Clay Jr., William McKee, was given a saber. There is no record that Henry Jr. ever was. I have looked. The papers of the governors, the official records of the state are at the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives. I haven't been able to find that document, so I don't know. Now, Henry Clay's daughter, Anne, was very active with veterans of the Mexican War and attended events with them for many years, long after Henry Jr. died and after she married her husband, Major McDowell, and lived at Ashland. In fact, she had one of those events here at Ashland. So it could be that something was done to clean this up for those events, or that it was presented to her at one of those. Once again, I don't have a record for that. So we always talk about this as Henry Jr.'s sword, and it may be. The exact story of it, whether it was used or not, we don't know. Now, we have several other swords in the collection. Most of them are Civil War era. This family was divided. Like many Kentucky families, there were Clays who served for the Union, and there were Clays who served in the Confederacy. Some obviously didn't want to see the Union divided or broken, didn't want secession. Others were comfortable or desirous of that. One thing that unified the Clays, generally speaking, was that whether they fought for the Union or the Confederacy, the Clays weren't fighting a war against or to end slavery. Like many Kentuckians who fought for the Union, they weren't doing it because they wanted to bring an end to slavery. They were doing it because they did not want the nation ripped apart. Kentucky was in a position where that would have probably been bad for Kentucky in a lot of ways, and it just wasn't something they wanted to see happen. They wanted their country to survive. So we have weapons that may have belonged to men who fought on both sides. We talked about Henry Clay's daughter, Anne. Her husband, Henry Clay McDowell, was a Union soldier. In fact, interestingly, of the men who served in the Civil War, he was the one who probably was pretty staunchly anti-slavery. His father had been and would have passed that to him. And we know that in 1860, he is residing in Louisville. This is just before the war. He's living with Anne, his wife, their children. I think at that point they had 2, maybe 3. Anne's 2 brothers, who are in their 20s, who are single. They're living there at Major McDowell's home. And then he has 5 people from the British Isles, 3 servants and 2 children who are apparently children of one of the 3 servants. So he's hiring European servants rather than enslaved labor. So obviously he was more anti-slavery than most. And one or more of these blades may have belonged to him. This one did not. This one is engraved R.D. Williams, 2nd Adjutant, Kentucky. Now, I'm not really sure who this is, other than he was someone who knew Major McDowell's daughter, Nanette, and presented this small sword. This is another officer's dress sword to her for reasons that aren't entirely clear. So this is not Major McDowell's. This one, however, might be. It is again an officer's dress sword. He was an officer, adjutant general of the state of Kentucky, among other things. So he could have worn this for formal occasions. The other thing that Major McDowell did that might have been an opportunity for wearing a sword like this was that after the war, he became very involved with an organization called the Order of the Loyal Legion, which was a Union veterans organization. And Union veterans would get together periodically, yearly or whatever. They had a directory. They did a lot of different things. And so this may have been a sword he wore as part of a uniform for the Loyal Legion. Again, you can see the blade pretty highly decorated. This one's more diamond shaped than the others. Again, very fancy. This is a guard designed to protect against the blade, and the knuckle bow, and a little sort of vestigial quillion. You can see the military symbols here. So this very well could have been his. Note the grip, it's wire wrapped. The material underneath is a common material for sword grips. This material we have on 3 different swords here. This is either shark or ray skin. Sharks and rays are related and have a very interesting skin. Their skin does not have scales like you would typically think of on a fish. It has these scales that are sort of pointed and almost like enamel. And if you run your hand one direction from, say, front to back, they're almost smooth. But if you go the other direction from back to front, you run against those points and you can pull your hand away and it's bloody. So they can be very sharp. This is often used as sandpaper because of that. But it's a grip that makes a very nice grip. You get a good strong grip on that, make sure you don't lose it. So it's also very durable. It holds up very well. I mean, you can see it here. We have 2 more sabers. You can see it on our sabers. This one I think was probably Major McDowell's. It's a little straighter, a little different model, but same basic idea. You can see the handguard here. It's got the U.S. Army, E Pluribus Unum, and the Eagle, the U.S. military. These are generally referred to as bars. Often, this one over here is a 3-bar. We'll come back to that. This one may be considered 4, 1, 2, 3, 4-bar, but still a saber. And I think this was probably Major McDowell's because of the U.S. and the fact that it's fancy and would have been the sort of thing someone like Major McDowell would have carried as an officer in the U.S. Army. Unfortunately, the records aren't entirely clear. I think this one belonged to James B. Clay Jr. Jimmy served in the Confederacy. Ended up as an aide to Confederate General John C. Breckinridge, and eventually on his staff when he became Confederate Secretary of War. So he was a Confederate soldier. This sword is a traditional 3-bar cavalry saber. This blade shows a lot of age and whatnot. Still got some pretty fancy decoration on it. It's just hard to see. While it's got a lot of U.S. looking decoration on it, the fact of the matter is many Confederates either picked up U.S. blades on the battlefield or acquired them otherwise because they were in short supply. The Confederacy never had the capacity to fully equip most of the soldiers they put in the field. This is a picture of Henry Clay's grandson, Charles Donald Clay, who served in the Spanish-American War and in the occupation of the Philippines by the United States after that war, and eventually in World War I. He also was, for a time, the commandant of the ROTC program at Clemson University. So, career military man. You can see here he's wearing one of those staff officer swords. Now this one is interesting because it doesn't look like a sword. You can't see the sword here. You wouldn't necessarily think that it is. This belonged to Henry Clay. He gave it as a gift to another man, something he did frequently. In the mid-19th century, canes were very stylish and popular. Many men like Clay owned large quantities, and they were frequently given as gifts between gentlemen. In fact, when Clay dies, he leaves in his will certain canes to certain of his sons and says of the rest, take what you want and give them the ones you don't want away. Now this one is really neat. It has a little tiny sword inside. So if Clay is at an event, the crowd gets unruly, he's got a little personal protection. Now, I have no knowledge that Clay ever used this, but it probably was some comfort at times knowing that he had it to hand should he need to do so. And that wasn't terribly uncommon. I mean, they're not unknown. So that's a sword cane that belonged to Henry Clay. So as you can see, we have a variety of blades in the collection from several different eras and several different people. For some we know a fair bit, others we know significantly less. But they're all interesting. They all relate to some important historical events across our nation's history. And they're really just beautiful to look at as well. Quite interesting as objects of art in their own way. So we're very lucky to have the collection that we do. As always, if you'd like to know more, if you go to our website, go to our catalog, there's a folder in there for Wake Up with Ashland, and all this stuff is in it. So take a look, and you can read up on them. If you have any questions, obviously let me know. But that's our collection of swords.
All right. Good morning. Hope you enjoyed the little show on our sword collection. It's kind of amazing some of the collections that Ashland has. You wouldn't necessarily think we would have certain kinds of collections, and yet we have some that are really quite interesting. And certainly the swords are among the more interesting collections that we have. They, like you can see, cover a range of eras, etc. We do have a few questions this morning. We have a question here. Julie Brock asked how the swords would have been displayed by the family. When we look at the photographs from the McDowell era, for example, and that's the first time we have images of the inside of the house. So we're talking 1880s all the way into the 1920s or so. They are typically displayed on the wall. For example, in the billiard room, what we interpret as the billiard room, which would have been Major McDowell's billiard room, he had a shield on the wall with a couple of swords beneath it. Annie Gibson, who owned the two swords that were at Waveland, according to the newspaper article that we have about them, displayed them under a picture of Henry Clay. So I think that was fairly typical. We today display Henry Jr.'s sword on the wall beneath his picture in the dining room. So that's a fairly common way of doing it. They may have been laid on shelves or whatever as well, but I think mostly would have been hung on the wall for people to see. Question was asked about conservation. Katrina asks about how that was done. Well, the fact of the matter is, thus far in my time here, I've never had any of the blades conserved. Really, mostly they're in good enough shape that that's not something we need to do. Conservation is one of those things that you do very judiciously because there's always some degree of risk, and it's also somewhat costly. So we typically only do it when we have a really compelling need. The blades are in pretty good shape, and very few of them have problems. The leather scabbards of the two short swords definitely at this point need some work. So that will probably be something we'll look at going forward. Both of those scabbards are at this point in a condition that without a little help, they may not be around a whole lot longer, or may not, they may continue to suffer. So that's an area that we need to look at. Other question was asked about Thomas and how we know that he was not good at math. Well, the fact of the matter is, Henry Clay took a great interest in his sons and spent a lot of time keeping up with what they were doing and how they were doing. And so we have correspondence that talks about the fact that he's having difficulty with math and ultimately can't pass that. So we know that from that. I also have here in my voluminous library a book right here. This is the Register of Graduates from the 1961 this is the United States Military Academy. And this volume includes a list of all the graduates of West Point from 1802 forward. So if we go to the 1825 class, it shows that Thomas didn't pass. He didn't complete his education. In fact, Henry Clay has two descendants who graduated from West Point, Henry Jr. and Robert Pepper Clay. There were at least three more who went and did not graduate. West Point is a very rigorous academy, so it's not entirely surprising that some did not complete their education. I'm using a webcam today for the first time, and so I'm not entirely used to this angle, so please forgive me if I look like I'm looking off into space. I will get this figured out here eventually. Anyway, so that's how we know that. Prior to going to West Point, Henry Clay's sons would have been educated first by tutors paid at home, and then they would have gone to academies where Henry Clay would have paid to send them. and then ultimately perhaps to Transy. Several went to Transy for a time before going on to the academy. So they were very well educated. Are there any other questions? It's great to see everyone this morning. It's great to have you all back. It's great to be back doing this, and we'll be back again soon. So we'll look forward to seeing you at some point in the near future. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good one.